Hello, Chris. Hello?
Yep. Hi, Maggie. Yeah, you got it. Yep.
Thank you. Just checking. Everything's okay now. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's fine. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
This is a notice for all participants. This is a public meeting and proceedings are being webcast live online. A recording will also be available for playback on the Council's website shortly afterwards. Please note that your name will appear in the live stream and in the recording. Should you not wish for your image to appear on these, please turn off your camera. Third parties should not record or film the local plan hearing sessions, and neither the Council nor the Planning Inspectorate are liable for any third-party recordings. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 9:30, so time for me to resume the hearing sessions as part of the examination of the Tunbridge Wells Borough Local Plan. First of all, hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. I've just checked the technology is working with the programme officer. Surely good. Okay, well, welcome back. For those of you who attended previous sessions, I think everybody here today has attended a session at some point, so welcome back. My name is Matthew Birkinshaw. I'm Chartered Town Planner and the Inspector appointed to conduct the examination. Just a very quick run through of the sort of housekeeping matters. I'm pretty sure everybody has attended sessions. Obviously, this is the penultimate one of the examination, so I will very quickly run through those. First thing to be aware of is the Programme Officer, Charlotte Glancy, isn't here this week, but her colleague Chris Banks is. So obviously Chris is on the call throughout, so if there's any technology problems, etc. Chris is on hand to help. Obviously, please continue to use the contact details that you have for Charlotte. So if you've got any queries with regard to documents, the website, or any of the administrative functions of the examination, please do speak to Charlotte. And Chris, I'm pretty sure, can obviously pick up the same emails. So again, any problems, just use the same email address, and either Chris or Charlotte will be on hand to assist. So we're on to matter 14 today. So we're getting towards the very end of the examination. So really going through a lot of the development management policies now within the plan, and looking today, particularly at the design and heritage and conservation policies. And then we've got a separate session this afternoon. So just again, a quick note, if you are attending this afternoon session, it's a separate Zoom login. So if we have a break today, just turn cameras and microphones off. But if you're attending this afternoon, it's a separate session. As per previous sessions, we'll go through the matters, issues and questions. So we should get done in plenty of time this morning, probably get done a little bit early, but we will take breaks as and when required. And just finally from me, really, just to play again, obviously keep cameras and microphones turned off. Use the raise hand function when you want to speak. If it's the first time you've spoken, if you could introduce yourself, let me know who you are. If you're acting on behalf of a particular group or client or landowner or just a local resident. And yeah, please do also engage in the discussion and the debate, but please do also stick to the points that you've made in your representations. Anything from the council before we get going?
No, thank you, sir.
No. Excellent. Okay. So the first, under matter 14, the first issue then, which is issue 1, which is obviously all about design and design standards. So this is where we go to policy EN1 in the local plan in particular. So again, we'll run through some of these questions, and if people have made representations on these policies, please do use the raise hand function. And again, if you want to speak about other aspects of the policy that I maybe haven't asked a question about, again, please let me know. So taking the first sort of question there, so again, these are sort of quite detailed minor points now. We're in sort of the detail of these development management policies. Within policy EN1, there's a requirement there for all development proposals to include supporting statements to demonstrate sort of compliance with a wide range of factors. So do you think that's necessary to set that out within the development plan policy itself?
So it sets a context. Oh, excuse me for a second.
Sorry, I was just trying to come off mute. Or if you want to set the.
It's all right. When do you carry on?
Sorry about that. I couldn't unmute there for a moment. My name's Gwenda Bradley. I'm a senior planning officer in the planning policy team at Tunbridge Wells. Good morning, everyone. Right, yes, looking at the first question. Basically, this policy EN1 sustainable design does apply to all planning applications, but as we set out in our hearing statement, and as it says in the first paragraph of the policy wording itself, it depends on the type of development proposed as to whether we would apply all the criteria within the policy, and whether we would expect those all to be addressed as part of a design and access statement submitted with the planning application. So basically the policy and the criteria within it would be proportionally applied. So there's a difference between the policy applying to all development and all the criteria applying to a development. It depends on what it is, the scale of it, where it is, the site context, and the site constraints. And as we set out in our hearing statement, if the proposal is for a householder application, a smaller application, for example, then all the criteria wouldn't apply. Although quite a few of them would, if you do run through the policy. Certainly the under theme 1, design character and site context, numbers 3 and 4 under that section would apply, where we're looking at siting, layout, external appearance, materials. Number 5 could apply. You could question whether you're using sustainable materials. Number 7, you could look at the lifetime of the building and whether it provides home working and can adapt to different needs. And then reducing in carbon emissions under number 8. And then again, still applying it to a household application. Highway safety and access could apply in that you might be losing some car parking at the front of the property if you're building an extension. And this could have a knock-on effect on highway safety. Under the water heading, you might be located in a flood area, or you might be proposing to use water more efficiently as part of your scheme, where you've got a bathroom or a kitchen extension, for example. And as for a lot of planning applications in our borough, moving on to theme 4, landscape, trees and amenity, we have a lot of tree coverage in the borough, and quite often extensions can have an impact on these. So we'd weigh that up as part of the application. That could also have a knock-on effect on the next theme, biodiversity, if you are losing trees.
And then residential amenity would apply where you're assessing impact on neighbouring properties in terms of outlook and loss of privacy. For a smaller scheme, crime reduction is less likely to apply. And then you could look at what design and construction guidance under number 8 are applicable from our list. And depending on the site context, it could be a conservation area appraisal or the householder guidance. And then under community engagement, have you consulted your neighbour on your proposed extension? So even though it's a smaller scheme, I guess what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the themes and the criteria within the policy would apply. And the larger the scheme then, you know, if it's one house going up to a major site for 200 dwellings, for example, more policy, the specific criteria within the policy would apply. So yeah, it is a long policy. There's a lot of information in there, giving you some background on it. We did have 2 separate policies in our draft local plan, one for design and development management criteria and one for sustainable design. And following the Reg 18 consultation, these policies were subsequently merged together. So it is quite a large, long policy covering lots of information, but we see it as a key policy. It will be the most used policy in our plan. And it's a catch-all policy covering everything you need as a good starting point in dealing with an application. And it includes, as you can see in the supporting text, a user-friendly design checklist for you to have a look at before putting a planning application in. So I hope that answers your question. Basically, it depends on the type and the scale of development proposed on which criteria would directly apply and how much information will be expected to be submitted with an application, and applicants could receive guidance on that from us in advance.
I think the content and thrust of the policy is absolutely fine. Obviously, it's like I say, it covers a wide range of issues. I think for me, it's this requirement to submit things. So, you know, requiring all development proposals to submit supporting statements. Yeah, I just don't think that's going to be applicable in every single scenario. I think what the local plan needs to do is set out, and we touched upon this on other sessions, it needs to set out requirements for development to follow. If you're then requiring applicants to submit things and provide things, then really that's the role and function of a sort of validation checklist for plan applications, rather than a local plan policy. So I think in policy, requiring people to submit statements for things, especially if, you know, for every single planning application, where it's just not going to be necessary in all cases, like you say, for an extension, for example, sort of start submitting statements on all these things. So I think really, I think you're right. You know, yes, this policy will apply to all development proposals, you know, as applicable to the type of development proposed. It's just the requirement then for all development proposals to submit supporting statements with every application. I just don't think it's necessary or justified for every single applicant. Bearing in mind, you could, you know, this is sort of, you know, local residents submitting an extension, for example. Yes, if there was, you know, protected trees or a flooding issue or, you know, something like that, then you could do that, but you could control that through the validation checklist anyway. Second question.
Sorry, sir, I was putting my microphone on, forgive me. So I just want to understand so that should we proceed to the modification stage, I know what needs to be done to the policy to bring it in line with your requirements.
I think the first paragraph, all proposals for development within the borough will be required to satisfy the following criteria as applicable to the type of development proposed.
Right, okay, understood. We need to be a bit more discriminating as to when things would be required.
Yeah.
That's the first point. Second point is we need to distinguish between those matters which are properly the subject of a policy and those which could ordinarily be required through the application assessment process, validation process. So, okay, we'll look at it on that basis.
Yeah. Because ultimately with these type of things, if for example, a scheme came forward and was going to affect something, and there was not the appropriate evidence to support it, you'd refuse planning permission because of the harm that would be caused. I don't think you'd be refusing planning permission because a supporting statement hadn't been provided, for example. It's about the harm that development would cause, rather than whether or not, you know, it had a piece of papers with the plan application. Because ultimately, as well, you get into the issue of, well, someone provides a sort of one side of A4 and says, "There's my supporting statement. I've met the policy." Well, that's not what the policy is trying to do. It's trying to ensure that development's justified where there's potential harm. So it's about the issues, it's about the impact of the development, not whether or not it's got a statement about you know, all these very, very specific matters for very minor things. And like I say, your council's validation checklist would kick in anyway. So, you know, requirements to design and access statements, all the rest of it.
Understood, thank you.
Second question then, which again is picking up on some of the detail of the policy then. So this requires a construction environmental management plan for all developments over 20 units or 2,000 square meters. So again, where's this come from and why is it justified?
Good morning, my name is Katie McFloyd. I'm the Planning Environmental Officer at the Council, and I'll take that question. The hearing statement for this question by the Council explains in paragraphs 6 to 10 that the threshold was chosen because it was felt to capture the more significant developments in the borough, whilst not overburdening smaller house builders or developers, or indeed generating an unmanageable amount of monitoring for the council. There are actually no definitive thresholds in any guidance, but this approach was felt to be proportionate, given that smaller developers and developments are less likely to have impacts that require consideration in a construction environmental management plan. The wording in the policy is for this to be presented at pre-commencement stage, which is a process that the larger developers are very familiar with. Our environmental protection team here at the council often conditions these plans in the context of noise and air and construction impacts of that ilk. But the council was keen that the construction environmental management plan also included some of the other aspects of EN1 with a view to encouraging developers to start thinking at early stages about aspects such as waste and sustainable materials and procurement. And so it wasn't felt to overburden developers, but rather sort of a valuable prompt that sits within the ethos of the policy itself.
Okay, any comments on that particular requirement then for this construction environmental management plan? Any representations on that part of the policy? Yeah, Ms. Benson.
It's really just a general comment while I'm here. I didn't particularly intend to speak on this, but it does worry me a little bit. I think the actual policies are great, and generally I think this is lovely, and I'd like to hear that, having had to do a biodiversity thing for an extension on the back of our house, it's great that small householders, etc., would be freed from some of those things that are very difficult. But the actual construction one and larger developments is, I would love to see something that would really tighten this up, because we've got a lot of construction already, Paddock Wood, etc., and we've had some in Five Oak Green, and the developers just ignore so much of what's going on. You know, Church Road in Paddock Wood, massive oak trees were felled. Berkeley Homes, they took out trees with TOPs on them, ancient hedgerows. And it does seem that they you know, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And I don't know what can be done about that, because it's heartbreaking to see massive oak trees taken down and then they just get fined. Nothing else happens and they're gone once they're gone. So that was just a general observation. So thank you.
Just in terms of the requirement, I think that within the submission plan, there was a small but material change, which was the deletion of the word above. So for development proposals of over 20 units or 2,000 square meters, construction environmental management plan that provides details on all applicable topics, and then there's deletion of the word above. So just talk to me why that's why that was suggested.
Yeah, very simply, this relates to the way in which the two policies were combined, which Brenda was talking about. Previously, the topics were literally above in the text, and now they're below. We could exchange it for the word below, or just leave it out, because it's inherent that the topics we're talking about are those listed in the policy.
Yeah. So what do you mean then by topics? Are these things like highway safety, water flooding, landscape trees, biodiversity? Is that what you mean?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay, let's just go back to it. Hang on. Yeah.
So perhaps it should be a reference to the matters identified in sections 1 to 9, 1 to 8 below.
Yeah, I agree. Because if you delete the word above, then it's left thinking, okay, what are the applicable topics? What does this then need to do? So I think just a bit of clarity there. Okay, any other comments on that from anybody? No. Okay, so under point 1 of the policy, you've got design, character, and site context. So subsection 5 states, where possible, materials should be used that are sustainably sourced by local suppliers and with low embodied carbon, such as recycled or secondary aggregates, and can easily be reused or recycled at the end of their life. So again, what are you requiring here, and do you think it's going to be effective? Is this something? How does this sort of work then? Is this something that you ask developers to do? Is how and equally, how would you sort of enforce it then come construction stage?
Yep. So if I take that one. So this element of the policy was added in because a choice of materials a developer uses can make a substantial difference to the carbon footprint of a development. And so this is really about ensuring the plan is in line with paragraph 153 of the NPPF, which talks about being proactive and being in line with the Climate Change Act. In terms of how it would be implemented on the ground, the council foresees there being 3 different methods for complying, I suppose. The first would be requesting proof of accreditation to a sustainable procurement or sourcing scheme, of which there are quite a lot available. examples include the Forestry Stewardship Council for timber supplies. There's international standards, which the larger contractors are often aware of and certified against, and manufacturers rather, and so on. So very simply, that the council could request proof by a certificate being provided by a developer. A further option, where perhaps for smaller developers, would be to just simply provide evidence in the form of a sales receipt or a purchase order. And this is a sort of method that the council currently operates in relation to renewable energy technology and choices in boilers and so on. So developers should be aware of that sort of approach. And it's fairly simple to implement. And then finally, an alternative could be to record intentions within the construction environmental management plan, which is already a requirement under the EN1 for those developments which meet the threshold. This approach seems to work fairly well at the moment at the council, and indeed, the policy requirement is that there were some respondents from the consultation phase which were concerned about compliance with this aspect. Indeed, proving whether a material had been sourced locally and so on. And I think the council would take a pragmatic approach here. Is it a fairly new area of policy? So the phrasing in the N1 states that this would be required where possible and where practical. Yeah.
And would this apply to all development proposals?
Yes, it would, yes.
So again, how is this working in practice then for, again, the sort of the sort of local resident and their sort of extension that they've built, got planning permission for it? What are you asking them to do? Are you putting pre-commencement conditions on, or what are you seeking to, what do you do in practice?
Yeah, it's likely that this would be enforced by pre-commencement conditions. Yeah, that's the way we do it for renewable energy. So for a small, a single dwelling, the method would likely to be sales receipts or purchase orders. Yeah.
And is that something that is, as the council got resources then to sort of check every extension that's, checking receipts of plasterboard and bricks and everything on every extension that's been built in the borough? Has the council got the resources to actually enforce these conditions and check every single material and every single extension that's been built?
Well, I'd say the checking process is quite simplistic and quick. It wouldn't be an onerous process. I'd also say that Tunbridge Wells is fairly unique in Kent and the South East, at least, in which it has an in-house sustainability specialist within the planning department who can oversee this element of the policy. So I think we're fairly confident that it can be monitored, yeah.
I wonder whether this forms, because obviously it sits within the first part of the policy, which is about considering impacts of development proposals. So, contributing to the street scene, et cetera, and, appropriate scale, form, height, massing. I wonder whether this should be wrapped up and sit more comfortably under it's about construction management, really, isn't it? And whether it sits more comfortably under that part of the policy, or equally, given that it's a sort of where possible, whether it needs to be policy at all, and whether it is just this is something that the council will seek to do, because again, it's that caveat of where possible, which I agree is needed, but then just brings into question again the sort of we use Miss Fenton and her extension, what does that individual need to do where possible? Well, to say, well, it's not possible, you know, bought my bricks from somewhere else. It just seems to be, you know, go back to, you know, sort of, I understand the thrust of this for, you know, a major development proposal, but, you know, for every single application, every single extension, what are you actually requiring people to do, and whether or not it's going to be effective, especially where it says where possible, whether people just turn around and say, well, it wasn't possible, sorry, I got my bricks from elsewhere.
I think the point's well taken. So I think what we could do is use the same threshold as exists in the second paragraph, which is the 20 units or 2,000 square meters. And 5 can stay there, but slightly amended. So it requires that someone's got their mic on. Someone's got their mic on. So we can say that the construction management plan should demonstrate that where possible, materials used will be sustainably sourced by local suppliers with low embodied carbon, such as recycled and secondary aggregates that can be easily reused, etc. And then have something in supporting text that encourages proposals below the threshold, as far as possible, also to achieve that ambition. So it doesn't become an actual requirement of smaller developments.
I completely agree, and I don't mean to sound negative, and the aspiration of these policies are very important. It's just the effectiveness of using it and the implications for, you know, every single application, from the sort of really small scale side extension to actually start checking and requiring people to provide receipts for everything. And it's obviously, it's the word local suppliers as well. Well, there may be a far you know, a supplier or, you know, provider of materials which have got far greater sustainability benefits, but aren't local. And it just seems a very sort of onerous requirement for every single applicant. And I think really the issue here is your sort of bigger schemes. And, you know, you've set a sensible threshold there of 20 units for, you know, considering other things as part of the construction phase. So it probably does sit more neatly within that category.
That's understood. And we'll exclude also a reference to local suppliers, because you're quite right, more sustainable provision could be made from suppliers more distant.
Ms. Fenton?
Thank you, sir. Yes, how does this apply to things like the strategic sites? Because if you're going to bring in your concrete and aggregate locally, that is seriously going to affect Tunbridge Wells' aim for net zero. Construction is not included in the Tunbridge Wells plan, which neatly means they might achieve it. But if you add construction in, and if it's been sourced locally, it must go into that mix. And I would just like to know, you're going to bring all the concrete and aggregate in locally, you have to add that then into your climate change aim. And I would like that explained.
Okay, one for the council.
This policy will apply to all developments over the threshold. So the strategic developments will be subject to its requirements.
Yeah, and I think that's where the local suppliers, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because yes, you want to promote the use of local suppliers and all the benefits that go with that, sort of environmental, economic, etc. But I think as pointed out, it's about sustainability, and it's about the use of sustainable resources, and they may not be local. And also, what is local? Is that the borough? Is that something slightly further away? you know, can all materials for all these sites be provided by solely local suppliers? Probably not when you're talking about, you know, national house builders, etc. So I think yes, yes, the thrust of the policy is entirely appropriate and is justified. It's just the detail really about it. Okay, any other comments? Okay, that was point 5. Point 12 of the policy then. Proposals should encourage positive behaviour change, such as provision of drinking fountains in public realm developments to discourage purchase of single-use plastic. So again, what's the justification for this?
So the council explains in our hearing statement on page 9 that behaviour change is obviously a very broad topic, but it is mentioned in regional environmental strategies that the Tunbridge Wells has adopted here. And it's seen to be a valid method to minimise use of natural resources, contribute to sustainable development. So that was the ethos behind it. Drinking fountains and reduce of single-use plastic was simply included as an example. It was something that was led by members here who were very concerned about this issue, but it wasn't intended to be exclusively related to drinking fountains. There are various other aspects that developers could do in relation to shared recycling facilities, promoting home working, sustainable transport provision and that sort of thing. So the council takes on board that perhaps it's a bit too broad and could be tightened up, but we're open-minded with that one.
I think this falls into the category of the local plan should include policies which are clear of what a developer should be required to provide, and I think obviously as you said, it doesn't do that. It's a sort of it's a statement really, isn't it? It's a statement, and as you said, it's not actually about providing drinking fountains. It's I think I don't think that the requirement is justified or effective. It's sort of context and scene setting rather than an actual development requirement from the sounds of things. I think what you said there are the key things, you know, sort of shared recycling, sustainable transport, opportunities for home working, live work. They would be requirements of a development, and that's something that you could control. But this is more just of a statement, really. So it's probably context for supporting text rather than an actual development requirement.
Yes, that's fine. We agree with that.
Ms. Davis?
Thank you. Good morning, Julie Davis from CPRE Kent, the Countryside Charity. I just wanted to hop on now before we moved on to the other subsections of the policy, if that's okay with you. Just a couple of points under the design, character and context section. We did refer in our original representations to the local plan. We've not done a hearing statement for this. We're relying on our original representations. And we do support the policy, but we have got a couple of specific issues about some of the wordings of the policy. And then so under this section, design, character and context, paragraph 1 talks about proposals retaining and where appropriate enhancing buildings that contribute positively to the locality, and it continues on, especially in areas of high wheeled AOMB, comma, and then this is the bit of the policy I've got concerns with. That paragraph finishes off, unless the proposed development is demonstrably improved overall. And I don't actually understand what that's contributing to the policy. And I think the policy should end after the AOMB with a full stop, and then delete the last bit of that sentence. I just think it adds confusion. And I have got another point. Should I move on to the other point I want to make on the policy as well?
let's just hold that for now. So let's just deal with this one first then. So yeah, good point. What does that mean unless the proposed development is demonstrably improved overall?
Yeah, so I think we should review that actually. Can you leave that one with us? I'll discuss it with the team.
Yeah, what you could do is let's just read it back. So actually, because proposals should retain and where appropriate enhance buildings and contribute positively to the locality and the street scene. There probably also needs to be a slight caveat there, because presumably there will be instances where proposals can't retain existing buildings or can't reuse existing buildings because of their sort of structural integrity, for example, and the viability of doing that. Obviously, listed buildings, conservation areas, other areas would have their own sort of separate protection and legislation covering that. But I think, yeah, I think have a look at that. So I do tend to agree, actually, unless the proposed development is demonstrably improved overall, it isn't clear, but equally, it probably does need a caveat in there that it's, that there will be instances, won't there, where redevelopment is appropriate, rather than necessarily retaining existing buildings. So yeah,
I think we know what it's trying to achieve. The wording needs to be changed a little in order to make sure it is achieved.
Yeah,
and made clearer.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Mr. Davis.
Okay, so that was point 1.
And then the other points is paragraphs 3 and 4 underneath, and you'll see the word density in there, and you well know our issues about density and thinking that the strategy of the council's got is wrong in terms of the A1B and of course the green belt, and that the housing requirement should be reduced in accordance with paragraph 11B. Our concern specifically with regard to this policy is it means that any new development that comes along, it's more of the same. So the implication is that in an area that has got low density will continue. And obviously, yes, the Countryside Charity, with a particular interest in countryside issues, the importance of the land in that respect. So perhaps, windfall sites coming forward, it's just going to be more of the same, and without so specifically, I'd like to see the word density taken out, but I don't think it's making the point that these are scarce land resources. They're given huge importance in the MPPF. And to loop back to the discussions we had in the very first early weeks of the hearings, that this is a really, really key issue for the Countryside Charity, that we want to be sure that every care is taken to ensure that the minimal amount of land is lost because of the importance of Greenbelt, and particularly here the AONB. Thank you.
We talked about some of the changes, didn't we, to sort of re-emphasise the main sort of density policy in the local plan, and I think that would probably cover it. I appreciate the concerns. I think because there's a standalone density policy, I don't think this would necessarily mean that you would always get, like I said, more of the same. I just wonder if there's anything in the supporting text which says anything about this.
I don't think there's anything in the supporting text, but if you look at criterion 2 under this section, we do specify that proposals should make efficient use of land and buildings. So we've got that criterion in there, and when you move on to criterion 3, we would assess each site on its merits. So we'd always seek to make the most efficient use of a site, but it obviously depends on its context and topography and relationship with neighbouring buildings, etc. But just wanted to point out we've got that criterion in there.
So the issue of density is a discretionary matter. It's extremely important that it's part of this policy, clearly. I think probably if we look at 2, where we're saying proposers should make efficient use of land and buildings, including through the reuse of buildings where practicable, we ought to put and appropriate, because clearly development which in its context and adjacent perhaps or within a designation which is of national importance, like an AONB, for example, it probably would not be appropriate to maximise densities. So I think the inclusion of that word in 2 would provide an immediate context for what then follows in relation to 3 and 4 in terms of considering density.
So I would just, if you wouldn't mind if I came back on that, sorry, jumping in here. If it's not appropriate to maximise density in the AONB, again, that goes to the heart of the council's strategy and, you know, our well-versed comments in the earlier sessions. Thank you.
As I say, so it's a matter of discretion and looking at the site and its context in any individual case.
Yeah, I tend to agree, because it's difficult with these things, because you may have a site within the AONB, a windfall site that comes forward where actually it would be perfectly fine to have a higher density of development. And I agree with Ms Davies that the policy shouldn't be set up that says, you know, you should just automatically just sort of copy or you know, just continuation of density of existing area. It is more site specific. Let's say you might have the odd site where, yeah, perfectly appropriate. You know, it sits with its own context, so you can maximise density. Equally, there might be a site where actually the opposite would apply, and you'd actually even seek to have an even lower density, again, because of some specific site characteristics. So I think it's just it's a balance, and I think what the plan does, and we talked about this on the density day, is it should, given the site, you know, the constraints of the borough, yes, be seeking to make the most efficient use of land and buildings for these windfall sites. But equally, there does need to be that sort of consideration of each case on its merits, really, and being appropriate to its context.
You're right.
Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Any other comments on that we just talked about there? Okay, so I think we've got on to question 5 then, I believe, which was around the building regulation optional requirements for water then. So again, what's the justification for this requirement?
Yes, so we set out again in our hearing statement, this time on page 10, how the council has prepared a water efficiency background paper, which is CD 3.104. That goes into detail about why we will be hoping to adopt the higher standard for water efficiency. Goes beyond the requirements of building regs. In summary, the justification is that water in the region is defined by the Environment Agency as being under severe stress. In the borough itself, water consumption rates are higher than both the regional and the national averages. We've undertaken a viability assessment and found that the implications are quite minimal of adopting this higher standard. The Environment Agency supports this approach and actually requested a more onerous figure, although we can't do that. And in my experience, I find that it's not too difficult for developers to meet this standard of 110 litres per person per day. It just involves incorporating quite simple measures into a new dwelling, for example, such as flow restricting devices to showers and taps, low flush toilets and water butts, which are relatively cheap.
Yep. Okay. So the only question I had here was whether or not, obviously, I think it's within criterion 3, you refer to it as meeting the tighter building regulation optional requirement. And I think, yes, you mean this is 110 litres per person per day requirement, isn't it? Is that set out in the supporting text just to make it clear? I know that a lot of the sort of house building industry will and planners will know what this means, but potentially not everybody. So I just wonder, is there anything in the supporting text?
I mean, it's not in the supporting text for EN1, but the readers of the policy are signposted to EN24 after that section, which goes into detail about this standard. That's one of the water policies.
Okay, let's just have a quick look then at EN24. Okay, so that's set out in EN24. Yeah, okay. Okay, any comments on this? Presumably all these requirements were tested as part of the viability assessment as well.
Yes, all the environmental policies went through the whole plan consultants, yeah.
Okay, so that was question 5 then. So the other question that I had on this policy was around the sort of pre-application engagement requirements. And let me just go back to the policy. Yeah, so this is part 9 of the policy. New development should be informed by effective engagement between applicants, local communities, neighbours of sites, local planning authorities, infrastructure providers, etc., etc. Applications demonstrate early, proactive and effective engagement, and that the views expressed in that engagement have been properly considered will be looked on more favourably than those that cannot. What does that mean in practice?
I think it's trying to, someone's mic is on. I think so. What it's doing is probably misconveying the message in the MPPF and giving the impression that some kind of bias might be in operation, which is not what's intended, clearly. It's probably better that section 9 stop after the first sentence. There's no need to repeat what's in national guidance, clearly. So I think that the second sentence can really be deleted because it is capable of giving a false message.
Yeah, I agree. Dr. Whitbourne, you've got your hand up. You want to say anything at this stage? Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Whitbourne. We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, good to
right.
go.
Sorry. What I was going to say has already been said, I suppose, but if I do regard Section 9 as it stands as a very dangerous policy indeed. If I take you back to Tuesday when we talked about the cinema site, I am very much in favour of encouraging community engagement, and there are times when that can lead to tweaking an application that would be unacceptable and making it acceptable. There are times when you can't do that because the use is wrong or the massing is wrong, or in the case of the cinema site, in my view, both are wrong. There's been very good engagement, and the council and the developer has certainly taken account of what's been said, and we'll just agree to differ, some of us. But there should be no question of favourable just because that box has been ticked. And I think what has been said on behalf of the council, deleting the last sentence at least, and perhaps a bit more of it, so that it just encourages community engagement, but with no question of favour from ticking that box. Thank you, sir.
Just in terms of the first part of the sentence, new developments should be informed by effective engagement between applicants, neighbours of sites. Again, is there a concern then that this is going to sort of almost introduce a requirement then for, going back to Ms. Fenton and her extension? Is there a danger there that it encourage, is he going to almost require people to carry out pre-application discussion?
I think community engagement is something that it is right to encourage. When you come to small extensions, again, that is something that a more local community can be very interested in. Things like the cinema site obviously are a major town development. There are smaller applications that come up in particular localities that do get the local community, maybe the residents association, excited. I think it's a good thing for people to take an interest in what is going on around them. And I'm for a policy that starts with 9 encouraging community engagement, but very strongly against favourable consideration because they've done that. It still needs to be decided on its merits, not on simply whether they've engaged with the community or not.
Okay, points noted. Yep. So I think obviously in agreement then, it's certainly the second paragraph, second sentence.
I think that's a very welcome change indeed.
Anything else then on EN1? Any other requirements that you want to
take the hand off then? Yes.
Oh. Yeah, Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Could I take you back to point 6, residential amenity? And we did mention in our representations, we just felt the wording of paragraphs 1 and 2 under that were a little bit confusing. If I take paragraph 1 first, so it says introductory paragraph, proposals should not cause significant harm to the amenities of occupiers of neighbouring properties, and then comes on to point 1. That development does not result in or is exposed to excessive noise and vibration. I just wonder whether it should actually say development does not result in or is not exposed, have an extra not before the exposed, just to make that clearer. And then point 2 is a very long sentence to read with lots of commas and extra words. So I get the gist of it, but I just wonder whether it's absolutely clear, whether the wording could be, perhaps fewer words might be the key here to make it, much tighter in meaning. Thank you.
We can tidy up the grammar there. That's not an issue, and I agree. Or is not exposed to would make a lot of sense there. So thank you very much again, Ms. Davis.
Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. I'm just looking at the other requirements. Okay, any other comments on any of the other requirements in this policy then? No. Okay, we'll move on to policy EN2 then, which is sustainable design standards. So this sort of takes it a bit further, really. So again, by way of introduction, obviously, so the first question was sort of the catch-all, really. Is this policy justified, effective, and consistent with national planning policy? So just talk me through, if you may, the difference in requirements then between what a residential development is expected to do as opposed to a non-residential development to comply with policy EN2.
Yes, that's fine. The council's sought legal advice on this aspect. The essence is that we're able to require non-residential developments to meet a certain sustainable design standard, but we're not allowed to require it of residential development, only strongly encouraged. So that's why the policy's been worded that way.
Ms. Davis?
Thank you. It's just a general point really about the minimum design standards being encouraged and whether council should be more aspirational and going beyond the minimum. If you can only encourage it, why don't you encourage something that is a little higher than just the minimum? Thank you.
So in terms of the standards then set out, especially for the non-residential, again, what are they sort of based on, again, sort of the size of developments, etc.?
The council commissioned some work on this by some sustainability and energy consultants, and that's I'll just get you the reference for it. It's within the energy topic paper. Sorry, so it's CD 3.99 to guide us on how ambitious and how far we could go with this particular policy. And the advice has been that BREEAM Excellent, or the residential equivalent, which is 4 stars for the home quality mark, would be an appropriate standard to aim for. It's a balance between something that's ambitious and would certainly push developers for higher standards, but without causing viability issues. So this policy itself has gone through the whole plan viability assessment by Dixon Lascelles, and also a more specialised viability assessment by the council's energy consultants, energy and sustainability consultants. So that's how we ended up choosing the thresholds.
Okay, any other comments on EN2? So EN2 and EN3 really sort of sit together, don't they? So we'll look at EN3 as well. There's obviously lots of supporting text there. Talk to me about the requirements in EN3 then, and for residential developments, how they're different, and again why they're justified. So it might be worthwhile just for others around the table, around the virtual table, just to explain what EN3 does that's different then, and why that's justified.
Sure. So the sustainable design standards are actually quite broad. They don't focus simply on energy and climate change, which is the focus of EN3. Sustainable design standards cover a wide range of environmental topics. So transport, water, waste, land use, ecology, pollution. There's under the BREEAM scheme, there's actually credits for innovation and management. So it's quite a broad environmental approach, and fairly efficient in that there's flexibility allowed in how you gain those credits for the sustainable design standards. You can choose a topic to focus on and consider the weightings of various topics to guide how you'd like to reach your target of excellent or very good or what have you. But whereas EN3 is simply a climate change mitigation policy that captures aspects of climate change that haven't been covered in other areas of the local plan. So that's why it focuses specifically on energy in buildings and climate change adaptation as well.
Okay, so just take me through what EN3 requires applicants to do then, and whether this is for residential, non-residential, or for both.
Well, in the council's hearing statement, you'll see under question 4 that there's been a huge amount of change and flux in energy policy in this area over the past, well, eight years really, since the written ministerial statement. And the council's been monitoring this and had prepared a policy, again, based on advice from consultants and viability implications. However, in the end of at the end of December last year, government announced an uplift to Part L of building regs, which is the building regs that deal with energy, specifically in residential and non-residential buildings. And as a result, the building regs uplift actually came into force only last month on the 15th of June. As a result, the council is of the view that this policy as written is no longer effective or fit for purpose. It's really been superseded by the building regs uplift. So what the council's done is, again, commission an update to that energy policy viability report that's been going on over the last few months. And we advised we were doing this in February when we wrote the climate change hearing statement. But we've commissioned an update to report to advise us on what we should do as a result of this uplift in building regs. And that update is attached to the council's hearing statement in Appendix A. What we've done is put forward a new policy, and I can take you through the basics of that if you'd like. So there's 3 elements to the new policy. The first is one relating to fabric efficiency. The second relates to the renewable energy element of the original policy, and the third is a new element relating to an overall target. So in relation to fabric efficiencies, the council's existing policy requires developers to reduce their emissions from energy efficiencies to at least 10% below the previous building regulations. That's 2013 Part L. However, the uplift that came in June actually requires an 11% reduction. So it does go further than what we had proposed originally. And so our consultants have reviewed this and advised that we amend that element of the policy with a new target for a 5% reduction beyond 2021 Part L, so the new Part L. And this would equate to a 16% reduction over 2013 Part L, so 11 plus 5. And it would therefore be compliant with the written ministerial statement for a 19% limit, which we discussed in the answer to question 3. So that's the first new element of the policy. The second new element relates to the renewable energy technology. So that the building regs uplift that's come in includes a 20% reduction from renewable energy technologies for a notional dwelling, and that's predominantly photovoltaics. Whereas our original policy asked for a 15% reduction. So again, it's immediately been superseded by building regs. Now, the council has decided, based on our advice from consultants, that this type of approach is now adequately controlled by building regs, and we don't see the value in putting any more additional asks, I suppose, on developers. And I can explain the reasons for that if that would be helpful, but I'll continue with the overview for the moment. And then the third new element that we've been advised to include in a policy of this ilk relates to an overall target for carbon reduction. It's an approach that's been adopted by several local planning authorities around the country, and it's considered to be very valuable because it draws attention away from fossil fuel consumption. Bearing in mind those new proposals, we went back to our viability consultants for the whole plan and looked at what they had factored in their assessment. I believe that was done in 2019. And we found that for part one of the policy, the whole plan viability consultants had allowed for a 19% uplift in fabric energy reductions. So that was beyond our 16% that we're currently proposing over 2013 Part L, which equates to 5% over 2021 Part L. So we felt that was more than acceptable to put in as a main modification to this policy. The overall carbon reduction target would exceed the build costs that were originally allowed for in the whole plan viability assessment. So we felt that at this late stage in the local plan process, it wouldn't be possible to require that overall carbon reduction target. So we've put some suggested wording in for a new style of policy, and we've used the wording strongly encouraged in relation to the overall carbon reduction target. And finally, there's also a reference in the new policy that we'd like to consider, which is to an alternative unit of measurement for compliance, which is based on floor area. And it's, again, a direction of travel that a lot of local planning authorities are moving in at the moment. So whereas in the past, we've all talked about percentage reductions, and that's the way the Planning and Energy Act is worded as a proportion of energy. But we find that that's actually not a very fair approach for developers, as it means that the least efficient dwellings, detached dwellings, are required to do less proportionally than the most efficient dwellings, which are flats, due to having less external walls or glazing or roofing space. Again, we're not quite sure on the legal implications of an alternative unit of measurements, and that would need to be considered in greater depth. But I know that there are some authorities that are going down this route at the moment for that reason. So yeah, questions.
In terms of the so like you said, there's sort of three areas of the policy, isn't there? And there's obviously the reductions that have been superseded by building regulations. There's the renewable sort of element requirement, which you've suggested to be deleted. But then this third part then, so within the appendix to your hearing statement, I think you've said that the policy will be changed to say, so strongly encouraged, developers are strongly encouraged to be proactive in seeking an overall carbon reduction target of 35% more than that set out in building regulations Part L. So just talk to me about what that carbon reduction target is, and sort of how it's different then. So how is that different from the part of the policy which you've deleted, which is presumably that was all about energy generation from renewable and low carbon sources. What does this new target of 35%, what's that based on, and why do you think it should be in there as something to encourage people to do? Again, it falls into that category of, doesn't it, of is it a policy requirement? It sounds like it's not. So on that basis, why do you think it's necessary?
I think this comes down to, I'd have to refer to my consultants, but I think this comes down to the fact that if we draw attention away from requirements for, it's used as an alternative to the old Merton rule style policy in which a certain proportion of energy reductions comes from renewable energy technology. So if we move away from that prescription about renewable energy particularly, it means that developers focus more carefully on fabric improvements. As I said previously, that the new element for renewable energy within the building reg uplift that's just come in includes quite a considerable allowance, a 20% allowance for renewable technology, which is more than sufficient for an average dwelling to put an array of PV on their house. But developers could do more. They could put more powerful panels on, and the more they do that, the less they improve the fabric of the house and various other elements, the heating demand standards as well. So the nature of PV is that it's quite cheap right now, and we felt that it was something that homeowners could retrofit very easily in the future. Whereas dealing with the fabric first approach, not just internally in terms of the U values and air permeability, but also features of design that really affect energy use. So the building orientation and layout, those are all important elements that would be captured by the overall target more effectively than a Merton rule.
So this is about like you say, it's rather than sort of building what would be a less efficient building and sort of putting solar panels on it, etc., it's actually requiring a sort of more comprehensive view of the design, its layout, solar gain, etc. It's sort of fabric efficiency, etc.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, any comments on the suggested changes then? Obviously, like you say, you've picked up recent changes in building regulations, etc., and you've sort of set out the reasons for that. Any comments on this policy suggested change? Nope. Okay, so just for clarity then, the suggested new wording, it's in Appendix 3 of your hearing statement, I think, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would any changes then be needed, consequential changes to the supporting text? Presumably would.
Yes, that's right. We would have to review all the supporting text and make sure it's still fit for purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, so consequence of that change, that would be obviously the main modification to the policy. Then you have a separate main modification to the supporting text. You can, I think, not sure if I've said this on previous sessions, but when setting out the main modifications, you just tend to obviously have main modification 1 changes to the policy, main modification 2 changes to the supporting text, and just wrap them up in that way, so that people can see all the changes to a policy and then all the changes to the supporting text in one go.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. We will. What time is it? We'll move on. Because people want to move on. People want a break.
We're happy. We're all settled here, so we're happy to continue.
Okay. We'll continue. It says heritage and conservation adverts, and then issue 5. So we'll see how we get on. Heritage and conservation policies, then EN4 and EN5. What does policy EN4 do? What's the requirements in EN4? Why are the 2 policies for the historic environment?
Sorry, sir. Can I just do a quick introduction first, and introduce my colleague who's going to lead on this. But first of all, I just wanted to do a couple of or inform you of a couple of updates, just minor things within policies EM4 and EM5. If I could just refer you first to paragraph 6.54 of the supporting text to policy. It comes before policy EM4 on page 338 of the submission local plan. And we refer to an SPD in that, historic environment SPD. I just wanted to confirm that this will be added or will be included in the council's local development scheme, and as and when policies EM4 and EM5 are adopted, they will be included in this SPD. So just wanted to confirm that work will be undertaken on that, and then subsequently this will be considered alongside other guidance documents set out under paragraph 6.56, where we list guidance documents relevant to the historic environment. And then the second update relates to paragraph 6.68. And that's on page 342 of the submission local plan. At the end of that paragraph, we refer to a new conservation area appraisal undertaken for the Warwick Park and Madeira Park conservation area. And that conservation area appraisal has now been adopted. So we would suggest that the last sentence in this paragraph be deleted, and some reference to the conservation area appraisal may be made in or moved to paragraph 6.70 on page 343. So we could maybe say something like, with the exception of the conservation area appraisals related to Madeira Park and Warwick Park, which have recently been adopted, and then go on to say that other conservation appraisals will be, which were prepared more than a decade ago, will be reviewed in due course. So just wanted to update you on that. They were adopted in 2019. I'll now hand you over to Debbie Salter, who's our Conservation and Urban Design Officer. And she's been involved in formulating and discussing with English Heritage and KCC Heritage all the heritage aspects of the plan and the policies, and that began in 2016 when we commissioned the Historic Environment Review, which is core document 3.36 to be undertaken. And this is a key document for us upon which the heritage and conservation policies and our strategy across the plan are based. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Would you mind repeating the question just so I can make sure I'm before Gwenda?
So it was just a question along the lines, obviously, we'll look at policy EN4 first. So policy EN5 is obviously more detailed, and that goes into, you know, what development proposals will sort of need to do. I was just wondering what then the purpose of policy EN4 was, and why there's two policies, EN4 and EN5. Do they do different things?
Yes, so that is the intention. I need to go back to the beginning with this, with the commissioning of the Historic Environment Review report, and our brief at the time to the consultants was based on the MPPF policies about, firstly, in terms of plan making, about firstly setting out a plan for a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment, and secondly, having an up-to-date evidence base and use it to assess the significance of heritage assets, and predicting the likelihood of finding currently unidentified heritage assets. So when the consultants undertook that exercise, they also reviewed the issues and options stage and having carried out the historic environment review, which, as you can see from policy EN4, identifies those overarching geographical themes with the social and economic drivers that that have produced the heritage assets, that the themes that we have in the borough. So it was suggested by the consultants that we have a discrete policy which cross-references the relevant elements, of that evidence base, and acts as a signpost to the other local guidance, which you can see listed in paragraph 6.56 of the policy. So the two parts were meant to sort of meet that MPPF requirement of having that up-to-date evidence base, making it quite clear as a discrete policy to anyone using this as a practical policy that these are the themes that have been identified, and these are the local guidance documents, SPDs, other assessments that relate to those themes, that directly relate back to those themes. And that was the main intention of that policy. So it then flows into policy EN5 and identifying the different types of heritage assets and what we want to see with applications.
So taking the first paragraph of policy EN4 there, so what's that requiring people to do then?
That is requiring people to understand what the local distinctiveness of the borough is, and how any new development will respond to it.
Okay, so you've got a list of guidance documents at paragraph 6.56 in the supporting text, obviously these SPDs, SPGs, etc. So that essentially just cross-references those. It then goes on, all development should contribute to the overall conservation where possible enhancement of the historic environment. Applicants must demonstrate how their proposals have regard to the advice set out in government historic environment policy and guidance. So again, what's the justification for referring to these, again, good practice guidance and advice notes within a policy itself?
This is setting out in the round, I think, what guidance we would expect to be referred to, proportionate to what's being proposed, so that we're saying that these are the local guidance notes and assessments. This is how they relate to what is locally distinctive, but also there are guidance notes that relate back to national policy and national and legislation that should be referred to as well in the round.
Because within this policy, you've then got an all proposals shall demonstrate, and you've got 4 development requirements. But then you've also got policy EN5, which is then, again, it just seems to do the same thing.
So the intention was to keep the policies concise, and we agreed throughout the process with Historic England and Kent County Council Heritage Team that that this was the appropriate way of making it clear that we'd done this evidence-based work and going that step beyond the MPPF and showing what was locally important and how we wanted to apply, or again, referring to the local guidance and how we would want to apply the national guidance to that. So EN5 is different in that it does, again, you're right, I suppose there's some repetition in that. EN4 leads on to the more specific requirements that are set out in EN5, but we felt we agreed with what the consultants recommended, and we felt that a discrete policy would make the two more concise. And so we're hoping that there's a flow from EN4 to EN5 in terms of this is what we found to be important. EN5 is discussing and what the heritage asset types are, local heritage asset types are, and then EN5, these are what is, sorry, in terms of each heritage asset types, this is what needs to be dealt with specifically. And so we feel it's quite important to have that warp and weft graphic in policy, and it just felt a lot neater to follow the consultant's recommendation and have this discrete policy, which keeps it separate from the more detailed requirements that are set out in EN5.
So I wonder if I might just come in there. I think I can anticipate where perhaps you're going with this. There are elements in EN4 which are essentially or in substance repeated in EN5 in terms of requirements. There are some which are not. It might also be said that some elements of EN4 ought properly to be in the supporting text to the policy. So what I would suggest is that although what is expressed in EN4 is entirely legitimate as an expectation and as a requirement, what we do is consolidate the two policies, put some of that into the supporting text and take out what is essential from EN4 into EN5 to make the policy read more cogently. So, for example, EN5 could commence with a section entitled Historic Environment in order to contextualize what follows in terms of impact on heritage assets, and to make the general requirement, which is entirely legitimate, that proposals for development will be required to reflect local distinctiveness, etc. And all new development, and that probably shouldn't be all new development affecting the historic environment within the borough should contribute to the overall conservation and where possible enhancement of the historic environment. Those are two perfectly legitimate requirements which could actually work as a precursor to the heritage assets section of the EN5. So that's what I would propose in general terms. And I think actually the policy could then be looked on as one cogent policy which looks at context and then assets.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the two issues that I had with it was again just making sure that again it's not requiring plan applications to again sort of accord or comply with this sort of long list of SPGs and SPDs that you've got, but also just making sure where you've got, because in policy EN4 you've got, all proposals shall demonstrate how development would preserve or enhance the historic environment. But then obviously within EN5 you've got different wording. So you've got conserves or enhances character, appearance, immunity, setting, etc. And so there's it's very minor. Sort of, you might think I'm being really picky about it, but I've sat through lots of planning appeals where people pore over wording of policies, and it's these differences where you've just got to make sure that if you've got two policies like this, that there's no conflict. Obviously, you're talking about preserving something in one sense and then conserving it in the other sense. So it's just making sure it's really tightened up on the wording, and to make sure that the plan as a whole is internally consistent.
So I've been there too. Perfectly understand the point you're making. If you leave that one with us, we will bring those together, make them cogent, and make sure that there's consistency in terminology, particularly with regard to the legal and policy tests.
Yeah. I think the work that you've done and the context of it is all entirely appropriate and legitimate. I think it's just making sure then that, again, it's that going back to what a local plan should do. Does the decision maker know where they go to? Am I under EN4? Am I under EN5? And just making it sort of abundantly clear what a decision maker or a developer needs to do in that regard.
Are you with me, sir, that it should be one comprehensive policy?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Thank you.
Which wouldn't, it wouldn't. I know that it sounds like you spent a lot of time with obviously KCC and English Heritage on this. I think if you made it one policy, you wouldn't lose the thrust of any of it. It would just be simply a case of avoiding unnecessary and potentially conflicting repetition within the policy.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
Yeah. And you're right as well, making the distinction clear between obviously historic environment as a whole and general, and then specific applications affecting heritage assets. I've got a couple of points on EN5, but a couple of hands gone up, so go to Maggie Fenton first, please.
Thank you, sir. Policy EN5, it states para 9 is effective. It sets out each heritage asset and its requirements for each of these in relation to any development which may affect them. Now, I need some help finding that because I've not been able to find the list of each heritage asset and the policy requirements in relation to each of those assets. So perhaps council can direct me to that. My other question is, does this include those listed on the Kent Heritage Register? Because certainly in Capel, those are of equal importance to the local community and our historic environment. The bloomeries, the hoppers' huts, the oast houses, most importantly, our dispersed farmsteads. Listings don't actually identify them, and therefore it doesn't inform any decision on the actual historic environment. And I'm thinking in particular of, for instance, East Capel, where we have Badsall Manor, which is one of our most historic, Badsall Farmhouse, which is one of the most historic buildings in Capel. But what is important is that all the oast houses surrounding it, although they're individually listed, Tunbridge Wells do not identify the fact that that is a historic farmstead, a dispersed farmstead. Equally, if we look at, for instance, Chudley, the centre of what will become a new town, we have Lily Farm, Sherrington Farm, and they are both historic listed buildings, but also what is important and what is important to the community is the setting. And we've got the oast houses, we've got the barns. Equally, up near by Fog Bypass, it's horrendously close to Lyd Farm, Brook Farm, etc., which are large clusters of the dispersed farmhouses. So I'm just wondering why those are not. I mean, the Kent Historic Asset Register is absolutely fantastic. And you'll see that Save Capel used it in its heritage report. But just the listings do not adequately encapsulate our historic environment, and that is what English Heritage recognise, that Historic England recognise, everybody recognises that you need to look at more than just a listed building. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Would you like me to respond or?
Yeah.
Okay. So sorry, I missed a little bit of the first question, Ms. Fenton. I believe you were asking about the list of assets. All of the assets that are listed there are available to see on our website or through a link if it's to nationally designated asset. The second point, we obviously, through the historic environment record and our work producing the historic farmsteads guidance, are very aware of the importance of historic farmsteads to the historic environment in the borough. And this is clear, very clear in the historic environment review. As you know, sir, the historic environment standards are referenced in the MPPF, and they are also referenced in our policy EN5. As Ms. Fenton was saying, the historic farmsteads that were identified through a review in 2012, that was a collaboration between KCC and Historic England, are identified on the historic environment record. And so we do have a method to identify these assets.
Can I come back on that, sir? Because it does actually say, not only does it set them out, but it also sets out the requirements for each of these in relation to any development which may affect them. Well, that sounds like somebody has actually done some sort of assessment regarding, I mean, you can't do it for any development because they're all going to be different, aren't they? I mean, if you're going to get a house next door, putting on a little tiny extension, that's going to be very different to, say, the setting of the Chagall Church. You cannot have already decided the requirements for each of these, as you say, in relation to any development which may affect them. You're not going to hang a Picasso in a supermarket, and I hope you're not eventually going to hang a Chagall in a new town. But
sorry, Ms. Fenton, which specific part of EN5 are you referring to?
It said para 9. It's actually in there. It said para 9 is effective as EN5 sets out each heritage asset and the requirements for each of these in relation to any development which may affect them.
So sorry, which part of the policy? So in policy,
well, it's underneath the beginning of it. When I looked at it's Tunbridge Wells's response to your question.
Okay, but in terms of the actual policy, then what change would you suggest needs to be made to policy EN5?
Well, I'm just wondering how they. Well, it can't be true, can it? Requirements for each of these in relation to development which may affect them. That can't have already been done, surely. I don't know. I'm just asking the question, but it doesn't seem to make sense to me that you can decide on the requirements with any development next to them before you know what the development is.
Is this potentially so within the policy? There's any development that might directly or indirectly affect the significance of the listed building, conservation area, etc., etc.
Yeah, I'm just reading. Yes, Tunbridge Wells' response to your MIQ.
If I could just come in there, sir, I think Miss Fenton's talking about paragraph 9 on page 6 of our response.
That's right.
And there's a quote in there which says designated heritage assets are the subject of separate legislative planning requirements as set out in the above supporting text for each heritage asset type. So this sentence refers to heritage asset types. So by that we mean listed buildings, conservation areas, historic parks and gardens, not types of development proposals. And I think that's where the confusion's coming in.
The supporting text refers to different types of heritage assets as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So we go through all those. And then we've obviously got policy EN5 to cover what's required for those when it comes to submitting an application.
So maybe it's just a very poor answer to your question, sir. I don't know. It's in Tunbridge Wells's response to this session.
I think, well, notwithstanding the statement, I think the policy is clear. Certainly in terms of developments affecting significance of heritage assets, and the requirement for heritage statements, etc., is obviously set out in the framework as well. So I think, I think that's pretty clear. Dr. Whitbourne.
Thank you, sir. I do think that this whole heritage section is an immensely important part of the plan. The borough is rich in historic environment and heritage assets. We have this important, nationally important historic town of Royal Tunbridge Wells, and around it, the whole country area of medieval villages and farmsteads, as has been mentioned, oast houses, a whole rural scene. So this is a very important section indeed, and it needs to be got right. At the moment, I don't personally have a particular problem with dividing EN4 and EN5 into two, one dealing with the general question of the historic environment, and the other, the specific matter of the sorts of historic assets that are. Equally, I would be perfectly happy if those are both brought into one section, as has been talked about. The important thing is that it should all be there and it should all be right. At the moment, I think that the wording of both policies, EN4 and EN5, leaves quite a lot to be desired. It is repetitious and it's not really quite clear, as you've pointed out, why the two policies are sitting as they are. Looking at policy EN4 and the wording of that, I look, for example, at requirement 2 of EN4, which demands a consideration of the relationship of all proposals with the historic evolution of the borough. I'm not at all sure what that's meant to mean. And if you're an applicant for the cinema site, well, for example, if we come back to that again, where the issues are fitting in with the local listed buildings around it and the conservation area around it, the massing, the use and all the rest of it, is a luckless applicant really expected to have a clear consideration of the relationship of his proposals, her proposals, with the historic evolution of the borough? And what is the historic evolution of the borough? Does it have a historic evolution? It was administratively cobbled together in 1974 by amalgamating 4 very different local authorities. Is that what's meant by it, or is it in some way harking back to a historic evolution of wheeled and iron making, of hop picking and hunting forests and the activities of the Stuart court in the 17th century? I don't see that as a useful or clear piece of wording at all. And I think that the whole of EN4 and EN5 needs considerable and much clearer rethinking on this very important subject indeed. I'll perhaps leave it there on question on EN4. I do want to talk about EN5 and the question of local lists and historic assets.
Yeah, I'd agree with that actually. All proposals demonstrated in consideration of historic evolution of the borough. It might be relevant in some cases, but really, let's just take a typical site in a conservation area. The test is whether or not it preserves or enhances character and appearance. That's the requirement.
Yes.
Now, the character or appearance of the conservation area, the special interest of the conservation area, may be its historic interest. So yes, clearly in that context, you would be considering history and historic context. I
see the point. I mean, the other thing is, of course, that the inclusion of that requirement, particularly with reference to the historic evolution, means that it places that particular expression in potential conflict of interpretation, which is not good for the policy itself and its application. So my thoughts are that 2 should actually come out, because it doesn't actually add anything to the policy or its requirements, and certainly doesn't do anything to protect the historic environment.
In terms of EN5 as well, if we go to EN5, and again we want to be really clear on what development proposals require or are required to do. National Planning Policy Framework sets out is of quite clear detail what is required of proposals, where they affect. Oh, I think you've still got your microphone on there.
At my hand.
Yeah. So the NPPF obviously clearly sets out what's required in terms of designated and non-designated heritage assets. Within EN5, I think it's the 4th or 5th paragraph down. Proposals should also comply with the advice set out in the NPPF. Is that not actually the sort of thrust of what is required of a development proposal? And whether or not the policy should just actually, it could just defer decision making to national planning policy, because within EN5, I don't think you've got the sort of the balancing requirements of national planning policy, especially for non-designated heritage assets. So these heritage policies are always very tricky because you want to set out your own policy without simply repeating national planning policy, but in doing so, there's a danger that you trip yourself up. And I wonder actually here whether presumably the council would just defer to the NPPF in considering planning applications.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. EN5 should be, when we're coming to sort of consolidate these 2 policies and make them workable, I perfectly agree, sir, that one should defer to the NPPF and not repeat its requirements here. But what this policy should do, in recognition of the balance which which national policy requires, is to layer in or layer on specific issues or requirements in relation to the borough and particular issues which the historic context and the historic environment within the borough raises for the purposes of any application coming forward, which might affect those assets or their setting. So that's how I would intend to approach the redraft of this policy.
It's because as well that policy EN5 starts with a sort of slightly ambiguous, proposals that affect designated or non-designated heritage assets will normally only be permitted. Yeah. And again, I completely appreciate why the policy says that, but in doing it, it adds this ambiguity to a sort of, sort of a layperson thinking, well, normally permitted. I don't know what that means. Actually, it's derived presumably from the NPPF and the balancing exercises within it.
I think the present wording is a well-intentioned, well-meaning and thoughtful enterprise between Historic England and the Council in trying to achieve an appropriate balance in the policies here, which is laudable. I think in terms of effectiveness, we need to review the actual wording itself.
Yeah, completely agree. Mr. Whitbourne, you've got your hand up. I think you said, do you want to say something about non-designated or local list buildings?
Yes, sir, I do, if I may. You do raise the question of whether it's this policy is sufficiently clear, and I'm clear in my mind about designated and non-designated historic assets, but I don't think the policy is wholly clear. We all know, and it is abundantly clear, that statutorily listed buildings are designated historic assets, as are registered parks and gardens. When you come to locally listed buildings, which are so vitally important in the historic town, nationally important historic town of Tunbridge Wells, Royal Tunbridge Wells, I think it's much less clear. There is no local list produced by the council. There is a local list produced, here it is, produced by the Royal Tunbridge Wells Civic Society and the Town Forum combined some long time ago, and you can see on it, perhaps, if you can see it at all, pictures of some of the local listed buildings here, which are essential to the character of Royal Tunbridge Wells and are not on the statutory list, but are within the conservation area. It was back in 2007 that this list was prepared, following a government white paper that encouraged local communities to prepare lists of buildings that mattered to them. And we locally here sought to prepare a list of buildings that mattered to us, that we thought contributed to the character of the Royal Tunbridge Wells conservation area. We can find that list simply to the Royal Tunbridge Wells conservation area, although there are many attractive and important buildings outside that area. They don't, of course, enjoy any statutory protection. But all these buildings on our local list do enjoy statutory protection by virtue of their position in a conservation area. And therefore, I regard them as designated historic assets. Others may differ. It would obviously be highly desirable if one had a local list that was more detailed than ours, but to produce such a list would take many, many hours of field work and historical research to put together. And our local list is simply, although there is some information about some of the buildings and illustrations within it, and there is a smaller version of it that looks like that, that's readily available, the main document being available in the public library, the Amelia Centre next door. It's readily available. And its intention is simply to act as a trigger when any buildings that are thought to contribute to the character of the conservation area are under threat, that they are then properly investigated to make sure that their future is properly considered. I haven't felt that the council so far has really taken that list very seriously. It was a lot of work preparing it. It was handed to the then leader of the council, who was at that time Roy Bullock, who thanked us profusely for it, said, yes, it'll be very useful. I'm not, maybe the conservation officer can tell me otherwise. I'm not very convinced that it's being taken sufficiently seriously within the planning department. I hope I'm wrong about that. And I would like to see a much clearer definition of what the council sees or what the national bodies see as designated historic assets. To my mind, they should include unlisted buildings that contribute to the character of a conservation area. And that's one of my fundamental points. There are other, perhaps more minor issues. like Arcadian areas within the conservation area where the preservation of trees is important and where trees actually do enjoy statutory protection by virtue of their position within a conservation area. There are, of course, things that we would all have to agree are non-designated historic assets. Among the more important of those, as I see it, are, for example, the shop fronts in Camden Road, which are specifically referred to in policy EN6, that you presumably come to in a minute. Now, those are quite important. There are double-hung sashes of great width, such as were installed in Victorian times, and many of which do survive in places like Chapel Place, which is in the conservation area, and Camden Road, which isn't. And the council very worthily is seeking to retain those where it can, but it doesn't actually have any statutory powers to stop a building owner demolishing the whole building, let alone the shop front. So there's a bit of a problem there with identifying something that clearly is of interest, but which you can't necessarily do much about other than encouraging people. And you can have a policy of encouraging, if you like, but it's not a policy that you can take to any extreme. Also within those non-designated historic assets are things like street surfaces. This well-intentioned SDP that the council produced 10 years ago, and as far as I know, done nothing about it since, does actually identify some street surfaces in Tunbridge Wells which are important. I presume that's in London Road, although there are things like that dotted all around the town, little spalls, brick pavements, highly important to the character of the town. We haven't gone so far in our local list to include street surfaces. We'd like to. It's all a lot of work to do so. There are other features like drinking fountains that are valued by local people within the street scene that are outside the conservation area and are non-designated historic assets. But I don't think that the distinction between various sorts of historic assets that are not on the greenback list or in the register of parks and gardens is clear, and it would be very helpful if it was clear. It is a very important matter indeed. The character of Royal Tunbridge Wells, which I keep emphasising, is a major historic town along with Canterbury, Rochester, Tenterden, Faversham, Sandwich, Deal, and Tunbridge Wells. They are the 7 major nationally important historic towns in Kent. That doesn't come through in this local plan, really, that Tunbridge Wells is a major historic town, and it should. I think, sir, I will leave it there for the time being.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a couple more comments and then wrap up with any final comments from the council. Mr. Lippard.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, sir. Brian Lippard from the Tunbridge Wells Civic Society. Dr. Whitbourne has given an excellent summary already, so I will confine myself literally. We agree with what Dr. Whitbourne has said. I really then will just deal specifically with the local heritage list. The problem with the Tunbridge Wells Borough Council line is that the proposed database towards the local list is not publicly available. It is not complete and therefore presumably not authoritative. And it doesn't appear to be being prepared with local community input. The point about local lists is that they are best prepared with such community input, as was the Sevenoaks local list, rather than being a top-down thing drawn up by the local planning authority. The references to the local heritage assets, I think I referred particularly to paragraph 655. Picking up from the national planning policy, there's all statements in there about, oh, we should have this. But the reality seems to be that it isn't produced. And thinking about the sheer size of Tunbridge Wells compared to Sevenoaks, I think we have to face, both the civic society and the council have got to face the reality of, have we actually got the resources to produce a list, a full list with the appropriate level of detail to pass a quality test? Now, I don't know if there is a quality test. And what Philip mentioned was that back in 2007 or thereabouts, what was done was produce a list of maybe photographs and addresses of buildings that we felt should be on such a list. Now, I can really only pose the question and say, could the database, one, be made available so we could see what's actually on it? And secondly, how much more than just a list of addresses does it need to have some standing? So one idea that just occurred to me listening to this was that the database contains mostly addresses, maybe a bit more information when we have it. If a planning application comes in to do something to a property that's on this list, then maybe the civic society and whoever do a detailed investigation at that point in time so that the planning authority, the planning department, can actually make a better assessment in the light of whether or not it really qualifies as a local heritage asset. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Svensson?
Thank you, sir. I was very pleased to hear earlier that, there has been another CAA appraisal for one area. If I look through the core document 3.37, the historic environment, and it mentions on page 52 the CAAs, I saw that there were 6 areas that had not been appraised, most of 10 years old. I was extraordinarily surprised to see that there is nowhere across Capel that has been appraised. I think that historically Capel is a relatively new parish. We were part of Tunbridge until 1972. And I think the general opinion within Capel, it's reflected in Tunbridge Wells Borough Council view that we're an outlier. We're removed from the Tunbridge Wells centric environment, and we don't belong. We're all, we have Tunbridge phone numbers, everybody shops in Tunbridge, we don't go to Tunbridge Wells. And I think this is really reflected in the way that Capel is treated, and a lack of understanding. Our main settlement is 5 Oak Green, but there don't appear to be any real assessments of Capel as a whole. What I've found in that document is actually that, ancient routeways, dispersed settlement, it's particularly vulnerable to poorly managed development, especially around Paddock Wood and 5 Oak Green. Extremely important transition area between the low and the high Weald. Most importantly, I think, is the area around Tudley. Ancient settlements are really important. And I don't want to detract from what Dr. Whitbourne said about Tunbridge Wells and how important it is. But Tudley is in the Domesday Book, and that's rather earlier than the spring that was found in Tunbridge Wells in 1606. This is an ancient area, and it should be treated, I think, with more respect than it is at the minute. as a whole, as one very large parish that is getting 60% of Tunbridge Wells' housing need. And it's disproportionate, inequitable, and it will, if we look at the 1 kilometre zone of influence from both developments, which you will have to look at when you decide on the planning application, we have 100+ listed buildings. Just about every single one will be affected because the 1 kilometre zone overlaps, just like a Venn diagram with 5 Oak Green in the middle. So that's my final point. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so council wants to come back on any of those points. Also, I'm mindful that the definition of designated heritage assets is obviously set out in the framework, set out in national planning policy.
Yeah. I'll come back on a few points. I hope by way of reassurance, and Dr. Whitbourne's points are well made and respected. The civic societies list actually is something which is taken into account by this local authority. It has it within its possession and uses it. And there is no reason why that shouldn't be referred to in the supporting text, because it is a valuable assessment and record of non-listed heritage assets within the borough. In relation to the town itself, there is, of course, in the LDS a local plan coming forward for Royal Tunbridge Wells town, which I have no doubt will focus on these matters even more fully than the plan does at the moment. There is coming through, it's not yet gone up for consultation, local list. And so the points raised by Mr. Lippard and others will be addressed through that consultation process, and there will be information provided in that local list, which provides a kind of information which he and others are seeking. I'm going to ask Ms. Salter very, very briefly, if she would, just to outline where we are with that process and what it means for decision making.
Thank you. We welcomed, obviously, the opportunity provided within the framework in raising the awareness and importance of non-designated heritage assets. We do have a supplementary planning document that sets out the process which we are taking in identifying and agreeing a local heritage asset list. We are in the process of compiling that list. The first stage after the compilation is to take it to a panel, and then following that we will go out to public consultation as set out in the SPD. At the moment, the list in draft form includes obviously what has been provided by the Civic Society, those that have been identified in the neighbourhood development plans to date, the Hot Pickers Railway line, which is mentioned elsewhere in policy, the historic parks and gardens that are on the Kent Compendium that are mentioned in EN4, essentially we also welcomed the assessment in the historic environment review that provided us with those themes that could cover other potential non-designated heritage assets, which is set out in paragraph 6.51 of EN4.
Yeah, I think paragraph 6.61, doesn't it, in the supporting text refers to local heritage assets, local list, etc. So yeah, I agree that there could be some, I'd support a change there to the sort of signposting of this document. If it is something that the council has and is used, then yeah, that could be expanded upon in the supporting text.
Very good, sir. Thank you. We have nothing else to add. Thank you.
Okay, they were the only questions that I had on obviously in 4 and in 5. We talked about some changes there. Completely agreed that that the sort of the work that's recognised, the work that's gone into those, and the thrust is entirely appropriate. I think it's just about sort of avoiding repetition and tightening up the wording. I propose we'll take a break then. There's just a couple more issues to go through, advertisements and shop fronts, and then ensuring comprehensive development. So I propose we'll take a break, have a tea and coffee break, and then we'll come back and finish those 2 issues. So we'll take a break until 12 o'clock. So we'll resume at 12 o'clock. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone. We'll resume and continue. Continue going through the relevant policies then, and 2 issues left. Obviously, we dealt with issue 3, which is heritage and conservation. One policy I don't think we're referred to, but it's worthwhile looking at, is the shopfront policy. Policy EN7, which was related to advertisements I asked a question about, but policy EN6 on shop fronts. Dr. Whitman, I think you maybe mentioned this. Does anybody, any comments or representations they want to make on policy EN6? No. In terms of the council, was there anything on EN6 that you wanted to sort of look at or consider again?
No, sir. Thank you.
No. Like I said, I didn't have any specific questions on it. And again, EN7. I think really the only comment on EN7 was I think there was a reference in there again just to something according with the Institute of Lighting Professionals guidance note, which we touched upon for the dark skies policy, I think. So again, it was just looking at the wording. Let's have a quick look. What does it say? And you see that one does say having regard to. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's consistent with our changing approach.
Let's just double check the other one. Yes, on your shop fronts, you've got in accordance with, and on that one, you've got having regard to. So actually the change is, so EN7 is correct and the change is then EN6, isn't it? But when you go back and look at these, just make sure that you double check the wording on.
We're going to do a check on all the policies where a reference is made to an external document to make sure the approach is consistent.
Any comments, observations, or equally anything from the council on EN7 then?
No, sir, thank you.
Nope. Any other representations then on shop fronts or advertisements or anything on these matters from any participants? No. Dr. Whitburn, I think you said, if you can hear me, I think you did mention you had something to say on shop fronts. I am going to move on now to the last issue. So if you did have anything that you wanted to say, now's the time. No. Okay, so the final issue then relates to ensuring comprehensive development, and this goes back to sort of policy STR4. So this is one of the strategic policies then. So just bear with me whilst I just turn to the relevant one. So this is a strategic policy which is about ensuring comprehensive development. So I think really that the key issue and the key sort of thrust of representations has been whether or not this is going to be effective in doing what it seeks to do, especially for I think especially for Paddock Wood, and this is an issue that we touched upon on the Paddock Wood Day, and we talked about some potential modifications to ensure that the sites there and the different parcels do come forward in a sort of comprehensive and coherent manner.
So I wonder if I might, I'm so sorry, I didn't.
Oh, go on, yeah.
If it assists, the approach to the redrafting of the Tudley and Paddock Wood policies, strategic policies, is such that it will encompass the requirements for an integrated and phased approach to development. So it's proposed that those particular policies, because of their high importance in strategic terms, and given the extent of the development proposed should, within those policies, require the development to be delivered in a particular way. And so it will be it's intended that STR4 will signpost this requirement, as it were, to those policies. And so STR4, although being consistent with the approach to be adopted for the strategic sites, won't contain the specific criteria in relation to comprehensive development for those sites, which will be in those particular policies. And it's important because of the components of the policies and the way in which they interact, particularly with respect to the phasing and implementation plan, which will be required, and its content. This will, in effect, therefore, apply to other developments than those two strategic sites, whose requirements would be dealt with specifically within those particular policies.
Yeah, and this goes back to there was a representation that's been made for this session, and it was the owners of the land at Paddock Wood. It was the farm building, wasn't it, at Paddock Wood, the western parcel, and they had representation at the Paddock Wood Day. And we talked about this particular issue and ensuring that, obviously, I think we agreed that yes, that site was, as part of the site boundary, part of the the allocated sites, and the policy, the plan would require this sort of holistic and comprehensive approach to development, to seeking to avoid piecemeal applications coming forward. Without looking more widely at strategic matters around infrastructure provision, etc. Yeah. So that was covered, and we talked about changes to the plan to sort of prevent that scenario.
Yeah. So in the event we go through, if we go through to mod stage, then it's intended that those policies will be entirely comprehensive. And incorporate all that's necessary in terms of delivery of those developments, subject, of course, to compliance with other relevant policies of the plan. But it won't be a requirement to comply with STR4 specifically, because these kinds of requirements will be within those policies.
Okay, any sort of questions or comments then on that change? Like I said, I think when that matters, issues and questions document was produced, I think obviously, like I said, things have moved on, and we've obviously had the discussion on the Paddock Wood Day. So anybody, any comments, observations, either on that or the suggested changes which we've already talked about? Yeah, Mr. Hayes.
Yes, thank you, sir. Yeah, just to say that I think that the council's suggested changes to the Paddock Wood policy would help address the issues that we'd raised on this matter. So we do welcome that, and obviously we look forward to looking at that, the drafted changes to that strategic policy. And I just mentioned again, and as we have before, about we think one of the key issues is placing all the emphasis on an SPD. So we welcome the removal of that, the reliance on an SPD in the future, in terms of that strategic policy on Paddock Wood as well. Thank you.
Okay, anything else then from this morning's session or this morning's policies that anybody would like to raise at this stage?
We are content. We know what's required of us. Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah. Okay, and nothing else from any of the participants? Nope. Okay, well, early finish then, so thank you all for your time and thank you for getting through that in good time. So this afternoon we've just got matter 15 to go through. So again, it's a separate session, separate login. So for those attending this afternoon, we will see you at 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you.